An Apache girl played deaf for 2 years straight, and when she finally spoke, her first words blew a rancher's entire world apart. For 2 years, he thought she couldn't hear a thing. 2 years of silent, watchful eyes that said more than any voice could. But the moment she opened her mouth, that first sentence didn't just break the silence. It shattered a man's life. It unearthed a promise older than his deed, older than his name, and it revealed a blood debt that was about to come due. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in his boots. Daniel Crow found her near the river, just as the sun was cracking open the sky. She was laid out in the damp sand, a tiny thing of skin and bone and ragged cloth. Her hair was a mess of burrs and dust, her lips cracked like the dry earth all around them. He figured she was dead, another soul claimed by the brutal summer heat. But then he knelt down and he saw it. The slightest rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes snapped open. They were black, bottomless, and they locked onto him with a strange and unsettling calm. She didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just stared, as if she'd been waiting for him. He lifted her onto his saddle and rode back to the ranch, the girl's frail body a feather-light weight against him. She didn't make a sound. Not when he laid her in the bed that had belonged to his late wife. Not when he held a cup of water to her lips, which she drank with a desperate thirst. Not when he gave her beans and cornbread, which she ate like she hadn't seen food in a lifetime. Her eyes, though, never left him. They followed his every move, watching, learning, weighing. But her mouth remained a sealed line. Within a week, she was on her feet, a silent ghost haunting his yard. The neighbors came around, their curiosity thick as molasses. They saw an Apache child, half-starved, and their faces hardened. "You ought to turn her over to the cavalry, Daniel," they'd say, their voices low and sharp. "It ain't safe." But Daniel just shook his head. He looked at the small, quiet girl who moved with a sad dignity, and he couldn't do it. "She's deaf," he told them. A lie born of convenience. "Can't hear, can't speak. She's no threat to anyone." The lie worked. It calmed their fears, and they left him be. Life on the ranch settled back into its hard rhythm, and the silent girl became a part of it. She followed him into the fields, lugging water jugs nearly as big as she was. She swept the porch clean every evening. She learned to gather eggs from the hens without ever cracking a shell. Her silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. He started calling her June since he'd found her in the month the cottonwoods bloomed. She gave no sign she'd heard him, no reaction at all. The name just settled on her, and over time, Daniel started to see her as part of the ranch, essential as the barn or the well. Still, she never made a sound. Not a single word, not even a sigh in her sleep. He didn't know it then, but 2 years of this quiet was just the calm before a storm that would tear his world down to the studs. The drought went on, relentless and cruel. The sun was a hot iron in the sky, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth. Daniel's herd was cut in half. The cattle sold for pennies on the dollar just to keep the bank from taking everything. Every morning was the same ride. Check the fences, count the heads, and pray for a rain that never came. The water from the well started to taste like rust. Even the wind felt bitter. Through it all, June worked. She moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman twice her age, her small shoulders squared against the weight of her chores. She could mend a fence better than he could, drive a nail with a single, true stroke. She never needed to be told how to do anything. She just watched once, and then she knew. Her silence was its own kind of teacher. The neighbors stopped coming by as much. When they did, their talk was laced with poison. "It ain't right, Crow," a man at the feed store whispered, leaning in close. "Keeping one of them in your house. People are starting to talk." Daniel would just nod, his jaw tight. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself, why he'd kept her, why he hadn't just ridden to the fort that first day and handed her over. Maybe it was the loneliness that had hollowed him out after his wife died. Or maybe it was the way June's dark eyes reminded him of her, strong, unyielding, never asking for permission to be. The debt was a vulture circling overhead. The mortgage payments were bleeding him dry, and the banker's visits were getting colder. "Sell a few more head," the banker would say with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Daniel would force a smile back and lie, promising the rains were coming soon. But the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. And still, June was always there, a silent shadow at his side. He'd catch her watching him sometimes, from the doorway or across the dusty yard. Her gaze was steady, impossible to read, and it made him feel like she was judging him against some secret standard he could never hope to meet. He told himself she was just a girl, a lost child. But deep down, a cold knot of dread told him otherwise. There was something hiding behind that silence, something ancient and powerful. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled his bones, that when it finally came out, it wouldn't save him. It would destroy him. The nights on the Crow Ranch turned strange. Daniel would lie awake, listening to the house groan and settle, and he'd swear he heard footsteps outside. The horses would get spooked in their stalls, their eyes rolling white in the darkness, snorting at something only they could smell. But whenever he grabbed his lantern and went out to look, there was nothing. Just the endless prairie, silver and empty under the moon. Then things started to go missing. First, it was a hammer. Daniel figured he'd just misplaced it. Then a coil of rope vanished from the field. Then a box of nails from the workshop. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. And then his spare rifle disappeared from its hooks in the barn. It wasn't stolen like a common thief would do it in a rush. It was just gone. Taken by someone who knew their way around, who knew exactly what they were looking for. Daniel started setting traps. He rigged tripwires to the barn doors and scattered broken glass under the windows. But every morning the traps were either untouched or sprung so neatly it was like a ghost had done it. He never saw a thing, but he felt like he was being watched. June said nothing, but he saw the change in her too. At sunset, she'd linger by the fence line, her face turned toward the distant ridge. She'd stand there, still as a statue, as if she were watching a play that was invisible to him. One evening, he walked out to join her. As he got close, he saw it, just for a second. A flicker of movement on the horizon, a tall, swift shadow against the dying light. He swore under his breath and spun around to grab his rifle from the porch. But when he turned back, the ridge was empty. There was nothing there. June, however, was still staring at that same spot. Her expression was calm, steady, almost like she was waiting for someone. The livestock got worse. A calf panicked one night and broke its leg on the fence, like it was being chased by devils. The chickens wouldn't roost, flapping and squawking in a frenzy all night long. Daniel started to think this wasn't about thieves. This was something else, something older and darker, the kind of thing the old-timers called a curse. He finally confronted her. "You see something out there, don't you?" he asked, his voice low. June didn't answer. She just turned and looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the lantern light. Then she turned back to the ridge. Her silence was an answer in itself. It was worse than a lie, worse than a denial. It felt like a confirmation. It felt like she knew exactly what was happening. She knew who was out there, and for some reason, she was letting them get closer. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat on his porch with his rifle across his lap, staring into the oppressive dark, and through the window, he could see June's silhouette, standing in the same spot, watching the horizon. He realized then that whatever was haunting his land wasn't just in his head. It was real. And the silent girl in his house understood it. What he couldn't figure out was why she wouldn't save him from it. The cavalry came to town like a storm of dust and steel, their arrival silencing the dogs and shutting the windows. Daniel heard the whispers before he ever saw a uniform. Apache raiders, they said. Moving through the territory, leaving a trail of fire and fear. A bounty had been posted. For any of them, dead or alive. The whispers followed him everywhere. At the saloon, at the church, at the feed store. The soldiers were looking for survivors, for strays, for anyone whose skin was the wrong color. Daniel felt their presence like a physical weight. When he went to town for supplies, he could feel the eyes on him. But they weren't looking at his worn-out boots or his empty pockets. They were looking at the silent girl who sat beside him on the wagon seat. June never looked at them. She just sat straight and tall, her stillness making them more nervous than any outburst could. "Crow's harboring one of 'em," a shopkeeper muttered, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. Mark my words. At night, new stars appeared on the horizon, the campfires of the soldiers, camped out by the river. The sound of their bugles was a sharp, lonely cry on the wind. Daniel knew to stay clear, but he saw their patrols, sweeping across the ridges that bordered his land. His land. He started to wonder if it really was his. He feared the moment one of those patrols would catch a glimpse of June in the yard, her dark hair catching the moonlight. They wouldn't see a child he'd saved from the river. They would see an enemy. They would see a bounty. One evening, Daniel asked her again, "What do you see out there? Who are those shadows on the ridge?" June turned her head and met his gaze, and for the first time he saw something shift in her silent eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was recognition, as if the ghosts that haunted his nights weren't ghosts at all, as if they were family. The warnings from his neighbors got more direct. "The cavalry ain't gonna look kindly on this, Crow," a man told him flatly. "You best hand her over before someone else does it for you." Daniel just nodded, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The girl wasn't just a charity case anymore. She was a lit match, and his entire life was a keg of gunpowder. But every morning, she was there, mending the fence, tending the horses. Her silent work was woven into the very fabric of the ranch. He couldn't imagine it without her. The soldiers pushed closer. Their patrols got wider, their questions in town more pointed. New faces started showing up at the saloon. Men with hard eyes and hands that never strayed far from their guns. Bounty hunters. Daniel lay awake each night, listening for the sound of hoofbeats on his property. He was caught in the middle of a storm he didn't understand. And he had no idea which would arrive first. The cavalry, the shadows from the ridge, or the terrible truth that June refused to speak. They showed up at sundown, 4 of them, riding in on a cloud of dust and smelling of whiskey and gunpowder. Drifters, the kind of men who worked for a week's pay and a spot in the hayloft. Daniel was desperate. The fences were falling apart, and his own body was worn down to the bone. He hired them on the spot. Men like that, he thought, didn't ask too many questions. He was wrong. June was standing by the corral, a water bucket in her small hands. She watched them ride in, her eyes moving from one man's face to the next, as if she were committing them to memory. One of the drifters, a man with a jagged scar down his cheek and a cold, knowing smirk, stared back at her. He stared for too long. And it wasn't with curiosity, it was with recognition. Daniel saw it instantly. The hard line of the man's jaw, the way his hand drifted down to rest on the handle of his revolver. The moment passed, but a cold dread coiled in Daniel's gut. That night, around the fire, the scarred man started asking questions, trying to make them sound casual. "Where'd the girl come from? How long she been with you? She ever talk?" Daniel gave them vague, half-true answers, but the man's eyes kept flicking over to June, who sat in the shadows of the porch watching, calculating. Later, hidden in the darkness by the barn, Daniel overheard the man whispering to one of his partners. "Chief's blood," the scarred man said, his voice a low hiss. "I'm sure of it. There's a price on her head, Crow. A big one. More than this whole damn ranch is worth. Daniel's hand tightened around the rifle he was holding. He wanted to step out of the shadows, to put an end to it right there. But he held back. These men were dangerous, and he was outnumbered. Besides, a part of him was terrified that they were right. He'd always wondered about her. Her silence, her dignity, the way her eyes always went to the ridge, like she was expecting someone. Now, the scarred man's words gave those doubts a terrible new shape. The next day, the drifters worked, but the scarred man never took his eyes off June. She moved with her usual quiet grace, seeming to ignore him. But Daniel noticed how she stayed out of his path, how she used the corners of buildings and the shadows of the trees to keep her distance. She knew he'd recognized her. As the sun began to set, Daniel found her at the fence line again, staring at the darkening hills. "You know who they are, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The men on the ridge." She didn't turn. She didn't speak. Her lips just pressed together in a hard, thin line. Her silence was a confession. It told him she was tangled up in secrets far older and deeper than he could ever imagine. And those secrets were about to tear his world apart. That night, Daniel sat awake, his rifle in his hands, listening to the quiet breathing of the drifters in the loft above him, and the heavy, knowing silence of the girl in the next room. He felt like he was sitting on a bomb, and June was holding the match. The silence broke. It broke like a dam after 1,000 years of pressure, a sudden, violent flood that swept everything away. Daniel Crow had grown so used to June's quiet that it had become the soundtrack of his life. But silence like that can't last forever. It happened on the worst day. The banker had come that morning, his boots too shiny for the dusty ranch, his smile oily and false. He reminded Daniel that the final payment was due. 3 weeks, Crow, the banker had said, patting the porch rail like he already owned it. Settle the debt, or the bank takes the land. Daniel had nothing left to sell. The drought had turned his pastures to dust. He was ruined. That night, he was at the kitchen table staring at his ledger. The numbers were a cruel joke, a testament to his failure. June was standing in the doorway, a shadow in the dim light, just as she always did. "Don't sell." The words sliced through the room. They were quiet, but they hit him like a physical blow. Daniel's head shot up. He thought he was hearing things, a ghost of his wife's voice from a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. But it was June. She was standing there, her lips slightly parted, her voice low and clear and real. "What did you say?" he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Her dark eyes were locked on his, unwavering. "Don't sell," she repeated. "It is not your land to sell." The ledger fell from his hands and hit the floor with a loud slap. 2 years. For 2 solid years, she hadn't made a sound, not a peep. And now this. Her first words were a riddle that twisted like a knife in his gut. "You can speak," he said, the words catching in his throat. It was half an accusation, half a cry of disbelief. "All this time." June stepped fully into the lamplight. "I can hear," she said, her voice stronger now. "I can see. You think this land is yours because you have a piece of paper. But it is not. My father swore an oath on this ground before he died. He swore it would come back to us." The room started to spin, the whispers in town, the shadows on the ridge, the scarred drifters' knowing eyes. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening snap. "You lied to me," he said, his voice hoarse. "You let me think you were deaf. You let me take you in." "I let you live," she cut in, her tone sharp as broken glass. "If I had spoken, they would have come for me long ago, and for you. But the time for silence is over. The soldiers are close. The land is crying out to be claimed." Her words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Daniel stared at the girl he had pulled from the river, the girl who had been a quiet presence in the corner of his life. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was something else entirely. something that could destroy him. In that single, shattering moment, Daniel Crow understood that his life had just been broken in two. There was the time before June spoke. And then there was everything that would come after. The weight of her words settled in Daniel's bones. The kitchen, his kitchen, suddenly felt like a foreign country. The girl who had been a fixture, predictable as the sunrise, was now a stranger with a claim that went deeper than any deed filed in a dusty courthouse. He tried to fight it. He tried to find the anger, but all he felt was a dizzying sense of dread. "What oath?" he demanded, his voice thin. "What promise are you talking about?" June sat down at the table, a queen taking her throne. Her small hands were folded, her gaze piercing. "My father was the last chief of the people of the river. When the sickness came, when the soldiers came with their fire, he made a promise. He promised the spirits of this place that what was taken would be returned. This land," she said, her eyes sweeping over the worn wooden walls, "was the heart of our home. It is not yours to lose. It belongs to my people." A surge of fury finally broke through Daniel's shock. He slammed his fist on the table, the wood groaning in protest. "Your people are gone. You're just one girl. This land is mine. I bled for it. I buried my wife in it." June didn't even flinch. "It was never yours. My father knew you. He knew your wife. He brought me to the river for you to find, because he knew you would not turn me away." Daniel's breath hitched. "My wife?" "She knew," June said, her voice softening just a fraction. "Before she died, she promised my father she would keep me safe, that you would keep me safe until the time was right." The memory hit him like a physical blow. His wife, Sarah, in her last days, racked with fever. The quiet visitors who had come at dusk, he'd thought they were neighbors, offering condolences. Now he saw their faces in his mind, their Apache faces, their solemn eyes. Sarah had been whispering with them on the porch, making a deal about him, a deal about his future, a deal she had never told him about. "You're lying," he whispered, but the words had no conviction. The truth was staring at him from across the table. June leaned forward, the lamplight carving shadows on her face. "I was silent for 2 years. That was the other part of the promise. I would not speak until the choice had to be made, between your world and mine. The choice is here now, Daniel Crow. The bounty hunters are circling, the soldiers are closing in. If they find me, they find a stray, an enemy, and they will kill me. But if I stand on this land, as the daughter of the chief, as the rightful heir, then I am not a stray. I am home." Daniel stared at her, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. The ranch, the cattle, the dirt under his fingernails, everything he had defined himself by was an illusion. He had been a caretaker, a guardian, a pawn in a game he never even knew he was playing. He looked at June, and he no longer saw the lost child. He saw the living embodiment of a debt his own wife had signed him up for, a debt he had been unknowingly paying for 2 long years, and he had a terrible feeling the final payment was going to cost him everything. The next few days were a living nightmare. Daniel worked from sunup to sundown, trying to sweat out the poison of June's revelation. He fixed fences that didn't matter, tended to cattle that were no longer his, all under the weight of 2 impossible debts. One was to the bank, written in ink on a piece of paper. The other was to a ghost, written in blood on the land itself. The banker's deadline loomed. 3 weeks, and then it was over. But that deadline felt meaningless now. June was different. The change was subtle, but profound. The quiet, watchful girl was gone. In her place was a young woman with a chilling composure, someone who had been rehearsing this moment her entire life. She still worked alongside him, her movements efficient and strong, but her silence was no longer passive. It was purposeful. She was waiting. He couldn't stop thinking about his wife, Sarah. The memories were tainted now, twisted into new shapes, her quiet strength, her love for this land. Had it all been a lie? Had she looked at him in her final days, knowing the secret she was leaving behind for him to carry? The betrayal felt sharper than a fresh wound. The whispers in town turned into open stares. When he bought grain, the store owner asked him if the rumors were true, if he was really sheltering the daughter of an Apache chief. The question was a loaded gun, and Daniel had no answer that wouldn't get him killed. He could feel the town turning against him, the fear and greed poisoning the air. The bounty on June's head was a siren song, and he knew it was only a matter of time before someone tried to collect. At night, Daniel sat on the porch, a bottle of cheap whiskey his only companion. The shadows on the ridge were more numerous now, no longer fleeting ghosts but a constant, silent audience. June would often join him, standing by the porch rail, her gaze also fixed on the hills. One night, he thought he heard her humming, a low, ancient melody that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It was a sound that didn't belong to his world, a song of ghosts and memory. It terrified him more than any threat. He knew then that this ranch was no longer his home. It was a stage, and the final act was about to begin. He was trapped between the banker's ledger and a dying chief's oath. And for the life of him, Daniel Crow couldn't decide which one was the heavier burden. The riders came with the dawn. They weren't soldiers. Soldiers rode with discipline, in neat lines. These men rode loose and hungry, their eyes scanning the terrain like wolves hunting for prey. Their silhouettes against the rising sun were a promise of violence. Bounty hunters. By noon, the news had hit town like a fever. The Wickham settlement, 20 miles north, had been burned to the ground. Some said it was Apache raiders. Others whispered it was the bounty hunters themselves, creating chaos to flush out their quarry. It didn't matter who lit the match. The fire was spreading. Daniel felt it the moment he stepped into the saloon. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Then, their gazes shifted past him, to the wagon outside where June sat, perfectly still. He heard the whispers clearly this time. "That's her, Crow's girl, the chief's daughter." And another voice, low and greedy. $500, dead or alive. Daniel turned and walked out, his hands clenched into fists. He drove the wagon back to the ranch at a reckless speed, the wheels screaming over the dry, rutted road. June sat beside him, her expression unreadable, her eyes on the horizon. She hadn't spoken again since the night she'd broken her silence. She didn't have to. The air was thick with unspoken truths. The circle was closing. That evening, the shadows on the ridge were no longer shadows. They were men, a line of them, standing against the setting sun, watching the ranch, waiting. Daniel raised his rifle, squinting through the sight, but he couldn't tell who they were. Soldiers, bounty hunters, or her people. June stood beside him at the fence. As he lowered the rifle, she spoke a single word. Soon. That night, the ranch was alive with a nervous energy. The horses kicked at their stalls, the dogs paced the yard, their hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in their chests. Inside, the small house felt like a cage. Daniel poured himself a drink, but the whiskey did nothing to calm the tremor in his hands. June sat by the window, a sentinel watching the darkness gather. For 2 years, her silence had been a mystery. Now her words were a prophecy. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats. Not just a few. It was a cavalry troop. The ground itself seemed to hum with their approach. They weren't circling anymore. They were coming straight for the house. Daniel Crow knew in that moment that he had run out of time. The war that had been a whisper was now a shout. And it was on his doorstep. The knock on the door was the crack of a whip. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Daniel had been waiting for it, his rifle resting across his knees at the kitchen table. The lamplight cast his shadow, huge and distorted, against the wall. Through the window, He could see them, a dozen men on horseback, forming a tight, menacing circle around his home. "Crow!" The voice was sharp, military. "Open this door. We know she's in there. We're looking for the girl." Daniel's blood ran cold. These weren't bounty hunters. This was the U.S. cavalry. June turned from the window, her face a pale mask in the gloom. And for the first time, he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. Not for herself, for him. "If you give me to them," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper, "you will live. Your debt to the bank will be cleared. They will leave you alone. If you keep me, they will burn this place to the ground with you in it." He swallowed hard, the taste of dust and failure in his mouth. The banker's threats, the dying cattle, the years of back-breaking work for nothing. She was right. He had nothing left. Giving her up was the smart play. The only play. But then he looked at her, at this small girl who carried the weight of a dying nation on her shoulders. He thought of his wife, of the promise she had made without his consent, a promise that had become his own, a debt carved into the very soul of the land he stood on. Sarah had chosen. Now it was his turn. He stood up, the rifle feeling solid and real in his hands. "This is my house," he said, his voice a low growl he barely recognized. "And this is my land. Anyone who comes through that door uninvited will answer to me." A sad, proud smile touched June's lips. "Then you have chosen." The door shuddered under the impact of a rifle butt. "Last chance, Crow. Hand over the Apache." Daniel walked toward the door, every nerve ending on fire. "She is not mine to hand over," he muttered, as much to the ghosts in the room as to the men outside. An order was shouted in the dark. Boots stomped on the porch. The wooden latch splintered. Daniel raised his rifle, the cold steel a comfort against his shoulder. June was right beside him, no longer a silent child, but the heir to a kingdom of dust and memory, a girl whose first words had sealed his fate. The door crashed inward, splintering off its hinges. In the sudden flood of moonlight, Daniel saw the face of the captain, his expression a mask of grim determination. But behind the captain, at the edge of the light, something else was moving. The men from the ridge. They were pouring down from the hills, silent as ghosts, armed with bows and old rifles. They weren't attacking the soldiers. They were surrounding them. The captain's eyes went wide with shock. He had walked into a trap. June stepped forward, past Daniel, into the open doorway. She stood framed against the lamplight, small and fearless. She let out a cry, a single piercing call in her native tongue. It was a sound of command, a sound of homecoming. And from the darkness, a voice answered. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, stepped forward from the line of warriors. He looked at June, and then at Daniel, his eyes holding a wisdom that transcended the conflict. The soldiers were frozen, trapped between the man with the rifle in the house and the silent army that had materialized from the night. "This is our land," June said, her voice ringing out in the sudden, tense silence, clear and strong, not in her tongue, but in perfect English. "This man, Daniel Crow, is its guardian. He has honored the promise. You have no claim here." The captain stared, his military certainty crumbling. He was a soldier, used to clear enemies and clear objectives. This was something else. This was a story older than his nation. Daniel stood his ground, his rifle still aimed, but he knew the fight had changed. It was no longer about him, or his debt, or his ranch. It was about the promise his wife had made, the promise he had just chosen to honor. The old man from the ridge took another step forward, holding up an open hand, a sign of peace, but it was a peace offered from a position of strength. The captain looked from the old man to June, then to Daniel. He saw the impossible situation he was in. To fight here would be a massacre, and his men would be on the losing side. Slowly, grimly, he lowered his pistol. He gave a sharp order, and the cavalry, confused and spooked, began to back away, their horses sidestepping nervously. They retreated into the darkness, their mission a failure, swallowed by a power they could not defeat. When they were gone, the silence that returned was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the presence of the people who had come home. The old man came onto the porch. He looked at Daniel, his eyes searching. Then he nodded, a gesture of profound respect. He said something to June in their language, his voice soft. June turned to Daniel. He says my father chose well, and that Sarah, your wife, was a woman of great honor. The debt is paid. Daniel finally lowered his rifle, the weight of it suddenly immense. He looked out at the faces in the yard, the people who had been watching from the ridges, waiting for this moment. His land. It had never been his. He was just a chapter in its long story. In the days that followed, the world shifted. The banker came back, flanked by the sheriff, his face smug with victory. He held up the foreclosure notice. Time's up, Crow. The land is mine. Before Daniel could even speak, June stepped forward. The old man was with her. This land was never his to offer as collateral, June said, her voice calm and steady. And it is not yours to take. It belongs to the people of the river, by a treaty that predates your bank, your town, and your laws. The old man produced a leather-wrapped bundle. Inside was a treaty, signed not with ink, but with pictographs and the thumbprints of men long dead, including a U.S. government agent from decades before. A treaty that had been forgotten by one side, but never by the other. It guaranteed them this valley, this river, this sacred ground. The banker laughed, but the sheriff, a man who understood the territory's older, wilder laws, did not. He looked at the treaty, at the silent warriors standing behind their chief, and at the unyielding look in June's eyes. He knew a fight he couldn't win when he saw one. He shook his head and told the banker the matter was out of his hands. The banker left, sputtering threats, but they were empty. His power, which had seemed so absolute, had vanished like a morning mist. Daniel Crow was a man without debt and without land. He stood on the porch, watching the people of the river move across the valley, their presence healing a wound he never knew existed. He was a stranger here now. He packed a small bag, ready to leave, to disappear into the vastness of the frontier. But as he went to saddle his horse, June stopped him. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Don't know," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Doesn't matter." "This is your home," she said softly. "You are the guardian. That was the promise. That will always be your name." He looked at her then, at the young woman who had shattered his world, only to rebuild it into something truer. He looked at the land, at the people returning to it, and he understood. His life wasn't over. It had just found its real purpose. He wasn't losing a ranch. He was gaining a family. Daniel Crow stayed. He became a bridge between two worlds, a man who honored a promise made by the woman he had loved. He lived on the land, not as its owner, but as its friend, its guardian, until the day he was buried next to his wife, on the soil that had never truly belonged to him, but to which he now belonged forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because we have so many more tales of the untamed frontier coming your way. And click the video on your screen now for another story of courage, secrets, and a destiny that could only be forged in the heart of the wild.